quickly, a bit of our background at psKINETIC. What do we do in terms of automation? Then I want to show you sort of two use cases. One use case that looks at how we've been automating referrals from patients from GPs and into hospitals. And then a second use case around privacy and GDPR. Talk a little bit about measuring value of automation, and then obviously the sort of maybe a couple of thoughts on how we have made some progress and some of the challenges we've faced. The background of psKINETIC is we've been an Appian partner for about 10 years, headquartered in London, working also with a team in India. Our initial focus was very much on healthcare case management, but it's interesting that the journey from sort of that case management has then really led us on to a journey of much more aggressive, if you like, process automation. And the other thing we're doing now, so we've been expanding from healthcare into, we've been doing some financial services, some facilities management, and we're now also doing some work in GDPR and compliance. So our mission, so we've sort of invented this term, return on automation. In essence, what our customers are looking to do is, yes, they're all interested in technology, but the question is really, what's the value that it can deliver? And the first example I want to talk to you about is something that in and around the NHS and in healthcare is referred to as referral management. And these are UK processes, but the process is not that dissimilar elsewhere in Europe and maybe somewhat similar in the US. The challenge you got is you got a number of doctors up in blue sending their patients to a number of destinations or so-called pathways. And as budgets are really tight and as obviously sort of the clinical paths become complex, what commissioners or the people who pay for the care have typically started doing is introduce so-called single points of access. And inside this bubble here, in red is really where we've developed the solution that we refer to as ART for advanced referral and triage. And the objective, if you like, is to get the patient to the right place first time. It was lovely. I went to see a setup in Brighton, and they had a relatively big call center with people who were taking manually referrals off the national systems, sort of rekeying two screens, copying and pasting, then having a combination of the administrators and or the clinicians having some sense or some description of what the various pathways were. Bit of work, bit of capture in Excel, bit of capture in the Access database, and then making a decision, I think this patient should go to an MSK, so musculoskeletal service, or he should actually see an orthopedic surgeon. And I was just mesmerized by kind of this really friendly and hardworking mess. And that's how we got involved in this. And the thing is also that these processes, they're really quite complex. So you have some, 25, 30 different specialties. And then inside those specialties, you have specific rules about age. You've got some geography issues, what area, what hospitals, or what services are you close to, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess the last thing for us here is, healthcare has never really been very good at sort of linking, okay, this is the decision I'm making, I'm asking for this outcome, and eventually I'm going to get this invoice. And of course, in all healthcare systems across the world, people are working hard on trying to send patients to the most cost-effective places. So that's those are sort of the drivers. And when we then started looking at this and thinking about automation in this space, I guess what we're sort of seeing a sort of pyramid of saying, what can be completely automated? Where do you need escalation up to administration? And where do you need escalation to clinical staff? And the process that we're going through here, it's quite tricky. So it starts with these. Part of the challenge here is that although we're connecting to systems, in this case, for example, the ERS, which is the NHS referral management solution, really a patient referral comes with an unstructured or just a semi-structured piece of information. So these sort of different types of letters, which may say, I saw this old gentleman, he needs to see an orthopedic surgeon, or down to some practices will be sending quite structured templates. So you got that going through, and then you got the process, which on the next slide I'll talk to you a bit more in detail, but it's really trying to extract the information from the incoming referrals, then validating this, deciding what is the intent, making a triage decision, and eventually book the patient into a service. So looking at this process a bit, and this comes back to Charlie's point about using multiple technologies, and I don't know, for those of you who saw Malcolm Ross talk about the sort of the little robot growing to a little bit bigger robot, to sort of a human-like robot at the end, I guess I feel we've kind of been going through that journey. What I guess is interesting about this process is, so we're really almost all the traffic or all the referrals, we RPA, so we use RPA on the incoming bit of this to get the referrals into our system. Plainly because these are all legacy systems, so there are no APIs. If there were smarter ways of doing it, we would have liked to do that, but that's just not proving possible. But one of these projects, when we embarked on, the customer said, well, shouldn't we just wait till the APIs come about? We just, they did decide at the time to go ahead, and 24 months later, that API discussion is absolutely no further. It's exactly where it was. And I think that's, in a funny way, we'll maybe talk a bit about that later, is that some of this sort of efficiency that you can, look, RPA is not perfect by any stretch, but it sort of solves a problem, can solve a problem quite quickly and quite cost effectively. And in some ways that, I think, is going to undermine the development of a lot of APIs as it relates to, sort of oldish legacy systems. Anyhow, so we RPA material off. We looked at the fact that this is coming in all kinds of weird and wonderful shapes. So we then use an OCR with a sort of an AI overlay where we're trying to identify the forms that are coming in. And in essence saying, we think with 90% likelihood this is form X. And we've then in essence trained the machine to say, okay, this is where the patient details sit, the NHS number, the reason for the referral, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, I kind of see, as the healthcare system gets more and more structured, eventually we will get more structured information from the referral source. But once again, I guess we've sort of prided ourselves in saying, look, we can drop this into almost any operating environment. So we're not beholden to other people changing their behavior, and that sort of running a project that makes one feel a little bit more confident. Patient validation is pretty straightforward. We're using some APIs and looking up. We are trying to extract. So one thing is to sort of get what's come off the form. The next then is to try to determine what the actual referral reason is. And this is an area where we've been experimenting with various NLP services. And we're not the finished article in this area at all. But it's one of these things you churn through. You start with something relatively simple. And this is one of the areas I feel we're going to make most progress going forward. And of course, with the recent Appian working and making it very easy to be calling on these various services, I think that holds great potential. And it's kind of interesting, isn't it, that Malcolm, you may have heard, talks about you send the same data to different services and they return slightly different results. So over time, my guess is what people are going to be doing is you're going to be experimenting with a number of these sort of external solutions. But the good news, of course, is that there are more and more of them, and they're becoming quicker and quicker to incorporate into your system. In terms of triage and triage decision, we have built, and I'll show you a slide later on. We built what we think is a pretty sophisticated rules engine in Appian, which then sort of takes, which we sort of configure together with our customer. But coming back to this idea of maybe 20 to 30 specialties, a whole bunch of different variations on that. And one of the things as budgets become tighter and tighter, part of what we're looking to do is to say, does this referral comply with the guidelines? You know, so if you think about it in an NHS context, obviously some of the first stuff to go was cosmetic surgery, so the NHS doesn't fund that anymore. And then there's a whole discussion about, you know, what are between using physio and sort of light touch musculoskeletal services versus, you know, much more invasive stuff. There's a bit of a debate, and I guess what we're excited about is building these sort of decisions or policies into a rules engine so that the customer actually is put in the position to execute, you know, what their policy is. Because often you find, you know, there are binders and binders of policies, but there's just no mechanism of actually enforcing that. And then the last bit is we basically RPA out the result and book the patient in to the appropriate service. So typically there are a relatively small number of systems coming in, and then there are a greater number of systems where the patient then exits, if you like. Now, why are we doing this? Well, we are obviously, what we want to get to is we want to get to 100% automation. So this is just a quick slide looking at, okay, so how long would this, so when this referral management is run, there's a sort of a distinction between where is it, typically it's contractual with the NHS organization or which will say this stuff must be clinically triaged, so you must have a clinician looking at it, and this stuff you don't need from a contract point of view. You may from a safety, but from a contract point of view, you may not need a clinician to look at. So this is sort of the typical time. If we're just looking at an admin process, we'll look at a clinical process in a second, you're taking about 6 minutes. And of course, the beautiful thing is that goes to 0 in terms of human interaction. And I can't sort of emphasize enough what a tough job these administrators are asked to do. You know, it's complex and highly repetitive. And one of the biggest challenges that our customers have is, yes, there's pressure on salaries, et cetera, but it's actually incredibly high churn in these type of operations. So, you know, often the idea of not having to recruit as many people doing this job is as big a driver as the actual cost saving. And then, of course, you have you get much more consistent decision making. And towards the end, we'll talk a bit about this idea of once you have a process that's quite tightly automated from end to end, that's the time when you can start using, you know, kind of increasing the sophistication of the AI and the automation that you're using. So I mentioned there's some processes where the clinician has to go in and review each individual case based on priority or certain specialties. And of course, here our job is to make the clinician much more effective. So in serving up the workflow, you cut off all the guff on both sides, and then you're serving up you're making it much easier for the clinician. So the use case typically before installing the solution will be that the clinician may have to open a couple of documents, look here and look there. And obviously we try to take out all that faffing. In addition to that, what this does is creates a much better audit trail. So it's very, very clear who made the decision, what information was available. And maybe the coolest bit is this idea of now starting to think back on machine learning and pattern recognition and serving up recommendations to the clinician. So underlying here is I talked about the rules engine that we built in Appian, and I guess one of the things is like, is this on the list of specialties or a combination of age, specialty, priority that needs to be viewed by a clinician? And if the answer is yes, we go down the clinical path. If it's no, we just trudle on and hope to automate it, you know, to 100%. We built this in Appian ourselves because this work started a bit before the Appian rules engine was developed. But you know, so I guess this proves you can build it easily. We can build it easily in Appian. I think it would be, if we started again now, we would use much more of the capability that's already available in Appian. I'm happy to take some questions as we go along. Actually, otherwise it could be getting a bit boring. So that's the rules engine, and of course, when we come talk about afterwards on GDPR and responding to whether it's incidents or subject access requests, et cetera, a lot of this thinking in terms of maybe there we use the term policy engine, is actually quite nicely transferable. And we'll talk a bit about that. The bit then is, how do you make the UI really nice and easy? So imagine you're a clinician, you go from like 3 different systems and moving up and opening documents and sort of chaos, to in essence, here's the UI, tells you all the details. You have a document viewer so you can scroll through. Sometimes these referrals come with 10 to 30 attachments because the GP system just presses send all and his system just goes and the poor operator who gets this incoming traffic may spend 10-15 minutes just trying to find the letter that says what the doctor wants. And of course, this is a beautiful, kind of quite a low-level OCR AI thing to just find the right letter. And then when you look down at the bottom here, it talks about what's the triage decision. And then what the system then does is, okay, here is in ranking based on the underlying rules and or the recommendation, this is the path that we think the patient should go. And typically here you would see, MSK path so-and-so by provider XYZ and MSK path and orthopedic surgeon so-and-so and so-and-so. But I'm hoping that gives people a little bit of sense of how this solution works. I'll come at the end. I'm going to wrap up and sort of talk a bit about automation success rate and what we've actually gotten out of it in sort of core numbers. But I wanted just to take a quick side tour and just talk about how we found when we started looking at GDPR and compliance. We found quite a few similarities, which may sound a bit odd. I should say that in the world of medical case management, this idea of, and Jonathan will be smiling now, but subject access request and people requesting their records is a pretty old, well-trodden path. So this is, we had some exposure to this well before the new legislation. So what we've done is we've developed some building blocks that looks at this wheel in terms of the data in the middle and impact assessment, subject access request, incident management, and vendor assessment. But what I wanted to do is just to link the first use case to the second, looking at subject access request and how we've been thinking about this instead of the triage engine now becoming, in essence, a policy engine. So if you consider an incoming subject access request, as you know, it could be one of 6 or 7 or 8 categories. What data are you holding? I want to erase it. I want to rectify it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. As you know, again, this detail can come in quite unstructured form. So we spend quite a bit of time thinking about how do you make it easy to capture this? How do you make it easy to validate? And you'll see that many of these processes are very similar. And of course, the area that I feel the similarity is maybe the greatest is in thinking about the matching the policies. So I had a great discussion with the CIO of a healthcare provider. We talking about GDPR, talking about the right to be forgotten. And he goes, gosh, I don't know what the hell to do because, we designed a new backup solution 5-6 years ago, really state of the art at the time. If somebody now comes and says, I want to be forgotten, and that's going to include those backup records, that's just impossible. Now, I believe what businesses are going to be doing as sort of guidance evolves, they're going to start saying, okay, as long as I have really well documented and it's tight and I've assessed this, you're probably going to get, I'm not going to say you're going to get away with a lot, but it will put you in a much better position. And the way I envisage the policy engine working in this scenario is really incoming request, asks the policy engine, does this relate to the piece of data that we just talked about, which I cannot delete? Yes, it does. Okay, these are the responses. These are the template letters or emails with the text vetted by our legal department. So we don't have case managers. So we don't have case managers who are just banging out stuff, or we don't have to use very, very expensive resources to answer those queries. The second part where this GDPR compliance generally, I think, has some interesting links with what we talk about on the healthcare side is obviously we've talked through the workflow and the SLA and the reporting, but you obviously have a big issue here in terms of what are you going to do in the systems that actually hold a lot of this data. And I guess I sort of imagine going forward that you will have, this is sort of a journey. You'll first tighten up a lot of the workflow. You'll get an understanding of the landscape. You'll be able to witness or have a much tighter evidence collection across big businesses. And eventually, you would want to start looking at automating a fair bit of this. And I know there are lots of specialist providers that run components down in these systems. But I guess it's our vision that with, where you got APIs, obviously we'll be connecting to the APIs. And where you have big old legacy systems, you're a utility company running a system from the late 70s, you would probably be looking to use RPA to either rectify, forget, etc., etc. So that I'm hoping that's helpful. In terms then of just and look, I am happy to take some questions because I feel that this is sort of a bit of a monologue. But these are some of the observations that we've had as sort of the path to intelligent automation. So I'll recommend there's a really nice little article written in Forrester about this, and and as I was reading it, I was going like, gosh, this is exactly what our experience has been. So starting first by figuring out, measuring the manual processes and understanding where the burden is the biggest is sort of a no-brainer. I think the next then is, and this comes back to Malcolm's diagram as well, in terms of, in my mind, first having relatively tight end-to-end processes is critical for using any of the really sexy stuff that we all eventually want to use. And I think those processes, as we've demonstrated in the referral management world, you can be plugging some of those gaps in the process with RPA. Leverage rules engine. I mean, I've got this term sort of slow learning because, of course, when you have it's not hard coded, but it's a non by itself learning rules engine. What you are doing is you're running through a bunch of transactions and you're figuring out, okay, that's working, that's not working. Once again, it's relatively straightforward. And then then in my mind, you start looking at the sort of the simpler AI options. We talked about, how we were using OCR with an overlay of smart form reading. And then eventually, we're then going to, okay, let's have the pattern recognition providing the recommendations to the physician. And eventually, of course, what we would like to do is we'd like to automate as much as we possibly can of this. So that's been our journey. And I think there's a risk of sort of pockets of somebody was saying out in the lunch break, yeah, let's just have a chatbot, throw a chatbot at that. And obviously that if you can throw it into a process that's strung together, that may make a lot of sense. If it's sort of just operating in isolation, maybe an interesting proof of concept, but it may not add a lot of value. Okay, measuring automation. So one of the things we found quite helpful is to sort of have a bit of a vocabulary to use with our clients. And this is really they wouldn't be impressed at Harvard Business School at this, but this idea of, okay, so we got a bunch of tasks. Let's first start by saying, what are we agreeing we are going to automate on step one? And it may be 60%, 70%, 80%. But so we talk about our sort of total automation rate, the whole process, how much are we going to, what's our intent? And then we go down and we say, okay, what is the actual, of those planned automation, of those tasks, what are the actual stuff we're able to automate? So at psKINETIC and at ART, we become quite obsessed with this automation success rate, and a lot of the work we're doing is driven towards what is the automation success rate. And the definition is kind of pretty straightforward. You got a whole bunch of tasks that we're planning to automate, and then we have and then sort of how many of those did we actually automate. But what I've been really pleasantly surprised by being sort of able to boil it down to one number. The BAs, the engineering team, everyone is sort of congregating around this, and it's good fun when the customer also gets very engaged in that, and when you're chasing the last bits, where do you go to chase it? Yes. So I wanted to show you a little sort of example here. Obviously, this is a very, very empty call center on the left-hand side, and then a little. It's not the world's best picture. A little monitor in the corner. But what I wanted to show you was this is on that screen is really the real-time tracking of what's happening on one of our customer contracts. And this has been, once again, how the kind of the MI is connected to this journey of automation. And of course, we're really, really keen to be measuring this automation rate. And then the discussion with the customer, where the hell did the 2% go? Now, on the one hand, 2%, somebody who's in manufacturing, they say that's terrible that you're only getting to 98%, because I'd be looking at 5 nines. But of course, we have a long, complicated process here with RPA, boom, 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 boom. And most of that 2%, I think you may be able to see it, is you can see the 2 stuck at the time here, which refers to identify the primary referral letter. And as I said, sometimes these referrals come with 10 to, I don't know, the record is 30 attachments. And what we've had is that we've had some corrupted documents, and we haven't quite figured out how to deal with those corrupted documents. So that's been sort of a big blocker in the process.